Okay, so we'll go ahead and record this session and stream it later for our Facebook audience. Again, hello and welcome to this Zoom broadcast of America United International, or AUI. Again, it is Thursday, October 28th, 2021, and I am your host, Dr. Zena Crenshaw Logel. Today, I will be interviewing Dr. Jay Joshi. You will meet him in just a few minutes. And as I explained earlier, we're having some technical problems. So unfortunately, we won't have a Facebook live streaming audience, but we will get this recording up to Facebook and everyone will be able to partake and we'll go from there. Those of you who are joining us here on Zoom, thank you so much. You're encouraged to use our chat section to comment on our presentation today. If you have questions, please use our Q&A section. That's a little different than chat. Everybody, I think at this point is a Zoom aficionado. So if you could just keep your remarks mostly in the comments section, and we'll use Q&A for Zoom for your questions, and that way we won't get anybody's question. We won't inadvertently overlook anyone's question because it gets lost up in the chatting. Our guest, Dr. Joshi, has already been warned that we're going to be putting him to work through what is called AUI's reverse interview. Now, how that works is we have our guests share their knowledge and impressions of AUI as a way of getting to know them, getting to know our guests. We have them talk about us. Isn't that, pretty egotistical? We have them talk about us before giving them a detailed introduction. So we'll see how that goes. The format is sort of like a quiz show meets The Masked Singer meets This Is Your Life. So let's hope it's entertaining and informative. But first, let me get Dr. Joshi on the screen with me. Welcome, Dr. Joshi. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Well, we lost a few minutes as I was dealing with the Facebook technical difficulty. So let's just dive right into this reverse interview. Why don't you go ahead and share with our audience your description of America United International? Do it in as much detail as you think that they need to understand what the campaign is about.
Certainly. America United International, or as I will call it, AUI, is a grassroots organization that's designed to address and curtail the weaponization of the American legal system and judicial corruption that takes place at the judiciary level and at the prosecutorial level. It is an important organization because it addresses the silent injustices that are so hard to quantify in today's society. When we see a police officer kneel on an individual who cannot defend himself, we immediately see the injustice. It's apparent and obvious. But when the injustice is subtle, when we cannot quantify it in obvious terms by what we see, what we hear, it becomes harder to address. And in many ways, the most egregious judicial atrocities are the most subtle atrocities done to individuals who do not have the ability to convey the injustice done to them. So why AUI is so important is because it's a grassroots organization, meaning it addresses the individuals affected, which is at many ways more important than broad policies that sound good but don't help the individual. So it is a grassroots organization that help individuals who are facing judicial misconduct but do not have the recourse to identify how the misconduct took place, to address why it affected an adverse ruling in their case, and what they can do about it. And for that, and that reason especially, AUI is an important organization that everyone should not only know about, but actively participate in.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, so far, this approach is really great because we could have said it better ourselves. Well, but let me ask you this, that you talk about the benefit to the individual that AUI provides. and the difference between a philosophical approach to weaponization of the legal system. And because we're going to probably have audience members who may not have any personal experience with that phenomenon, we're going to try to flush that out a bit. But let me ask you, so what interested you in no, a better way of asking is AUI relevant to you and your life in any specific way other than you commending the value to the individual of this effort?
No, certainly. So I have direct experience with judicial injustice in my own personal case as a physician. I don't know how much we want to get into this, but a few years ago, when I was practicing medicine in Munster, Indiana, there was a former employee of mine who was systematically forging scripts under my name. When I had reported her, I inadvertently found myself as the culprit in that the employee was co-opting the police to then create a case against me. And throughout the judicial deliberations, the judge was not permitting exculpatory evidence. It was clearly a biased proceeding in which the prosecutors took a win at any cost approach to convicting me. And I essentially lost the ability to defend myself because I had lost both procedural due process and the ability to bring in exculpatory evidence. And when I try to explain that to individuals, it's hard for them to understand because people don't see the judicial system for what it is unless they're within it, unless they're affected by it, which is critical for people to understand. When we talk about broad policies and judicial reform, it's easy for people to talk in platitudes, talk in a platonic sense that, hey, we should do this, hey, the judges should do that. But when you are directly affected and you start to see the individual judicial misconducts that take place and how subtly they're allowed to go unchecked, you start to develop a unique perspective for judicial injustice in its most raw and apparent form. And I think that it's very important for people to realize that as we start to understand the importance of equity in society, not just obvious ethical considerations, but subconscious decision making and how the law applies to all peoples in the United States, these types of subtle forms of injustice become more paramount to address because they are the lingering vestigial remains of discrimination in this country.
Very, your command of the big picture is just really impressive. And I don't want to commandeer what you want to discuss today, but I'm more than content to try to learn more about your individual encounter with this phenomenon that we're calling weaponization of the legal system, or you could say that a denial of due process. So if let's get down to basics, because I've heard about this before, but I'm trying to figure out how, as a physician, and we're starting to learn about you. This is,
Mhm.
and at some point we're going to have you formally introduce yourself. But we found out that you're a physician. Well, as a physician, you you had an employee who was misusing your prescription pad, right?
Correct.
So how does that translate into the government coming after the physician? I don't quite understand that. Can you elaborate so in a way that people who are not familiar with how that the profession works, how does that get to be about your misconduct?
Sure. So let me talk in three ways. I'll talk broad picture, I'll
Hmm.
talk individual case, and I'll talk about why my individual case led me to support AUI. So, broad picture, everybody's fully aware of the opioid epidemic. It's a lingering phenomenon, whether it is truly an epidemic or simply an epidemic that was concocted by policymakers to justify certain actions. I'll leave it for others to decide. But lo and behold, we are in what's called the opiate epidemic. This is a phenomenon that, according to the narrative that has now been debunked multiple times, prescription opioids led to a rise in opioid abuse and subsequent mortality in American society. That's the prevailing notion. It's been proven erroneous,
Mm.
yet nevertheless it persists. So the way law enforcement believed the appropriate measure to address the epidemic would be were to target physicians, identify those who are at high risk of misprescribing or high risk of having the opioids that they are prescribing being diverted to those who would abuse opioids. So when I had my now transitioning to the individual, when I had this employee write scripts under my name, I knew it was an obvious crime. So I reported it. But in the eyes of the law enforcement, the local Munster, Indiana police law enforcement and the Northwest Indiana DEA, they believed, at least they rationalized in their minds, that it was more important to arrest me to set an example for opioid abuse through diversion than to address the true fundamental means of the crimes. And that seems counterintuitive because it is. But in the eyes of law enforcement, if the policies you're following, physicians prescribing opioid epidemic, is an ethos by which you're investigating and adjudicating opioid related crimes, you're going to then justify your behavior. Effectively, the ends justify the means. So, in the eyes of the local law enforcement and the DEA, they believed taking this employee, despite knowing that she had forged significant number of scripts under my name, and use her statements to then come after me as a high-risk opioid prescriber, the local Munster police and the DEA justified that they were making strides in the opiate epidemic. The way to look at this now in terms of why it's so important for AUI to come in is, simply put, the interpretations of the law affect the implementation of the law at an individual level. How law enforcement and prosecutors choose to interpret laws determines how people are affected when they are in the courts. The courts are nothing more than a vehicle to implement and enforce the laws. So if prosecutors are misinterpreting key laws, the implementation will obviously be erroneous. It's simple cause and effect. A good example would be the phrase separate but equal. If you look at how that phrase was originally interpreted in the Jim Crow era, separate but equal was interpreted that African Americans and Caucasian Americans were legally equal, but socially not. So it justified all sorts of discriminatory policies at a social level against African Americans. The interpretation of that statement affected the implementation of the laws. What happened with Brown v. Board of Education 1954 was not that a new law was enacted. They simply adjusted the interpretation of the law. And so what you're seeing now, and that essentially led to the civil rights movement. What you're seeing now is pernicious interpretations of the law that adversely affect physicians. Now, it doesn't become manifest unless you are the physician being affected, because the way it is characterized by prosecutors and media outlets that work closely with the prosecutors is that you were targeted because you did something wrong. You must have done something wrong. So you start to see these insinuations broadcast throughout media outlets purporting some statistic, like in my case, 6,000 opioid prescriptions, even though the prosecutors knew that a bulk of those prescriptions were not written by me. Nevertheless, it was a number, an impression, and then a subsequent conviction. So they create these pernicious interpretations to justify the implementation of the laws in a certain way that adversely affect physicians, to justify the erroneous, debunked approach to the opiate epidemic. And I'm trying to convey this in as logical, as linear a manner as possible. It's essentially demonstrating that bad policies lead to individuals disproportionately affected in courts, with a legal system that robs individuals of the right to address the judicial misconduct. And that's where AUI comes in, because it provides a platform for the individual to convey the misconduct that took place at an individual level against them.
Okay. So, but why, medical physicians or medical doctors are not a historically disadvantaged group. You're educated, you have some incomes, even though the stereotype of the wealthy physician is not quite, prevailing in these bad economic times. Why isn't it just enough to have your lawyer advocate for you make, even in the context of your prosecution, your criminal prosecution, these policy arguments. And even with it failing there, having the industry, the medical profession, lobby or address the underlying public policy concerns through legislative action. Why didn't that fix the problem?
I wish it would. And if everything went according to how you described it, I think that would lead to part of the solution. But it doesn't work that way because inherent in what you asked were two sources of problems: the lack of appropriate defense for physicians, first and foremost, and two, the lack of a coherent organization helping physicians. So let's start with the first part, which is the lack of appropriate defense. Historically, physicians have not fared well in court because of that perception that physicians are well off. They're typically seen as white collar crimes. So there's this perception in society that if a physician is targeted by a prosecutor, they must have done something wrong. It's this circular logic that's reinforced over and over that perpetuates a lot of societal ills. I think a certain way, therefore, the way I think must be true. So, what happens as you are seeking defense counsel, unless it is so egregious of a crime that, for example, if I were indicted for a murder in Alaska and I never stepped foot in Alaska in my entire life, that's an obvious case that a defense attorney can lead to, but can lead and win. But if a defense attorney is now having to parse through the nuances of clinical medicine and address the complexities of the opioid epidemic, a defense attorney is going to make the internal judgment that it's better to plead guilty and minimize the sentencing than learn what I need to learn about clinical medicine, about addiction medicine, and present that in court. The American legal system has had a significant problem, long-standing, in incorporating medical concepts into the legal fold. This has started with the do no harm phrase that perpetuates throughout the courts that's been maliciously reinterpreted. It starts with so much of medicine being co-opted into legal terms that medicine as a whole has become effectively a legal entity to be interpreted and defined in legal terms. So when you are at the behest of legal interpretation as a defense attorney, you're not going to defend a physician as well as you should have because you already realize that the medical system is defined through legal terms. So the conceptual framework is already there for a prosecutor to win. Why hasn't organizations like the American Medical Association or other institutes helped physicians? Well, because that stereotype of if you were indicted or targeted, you must have done something wrong is so prevalent. But to the credit of the American Medical Association and other institutions, they are now finally starting to speak out against a lot of the prosecutorial misconduct that's taking place against physicians in the opioid epidemic. The American Medical Association recently instituted an opioid task force, a pain task force. These organizations specifically designed to combat erroneous policies being enforced by the Drug Enforcement Agency and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So you're starting to see some of that, but I think that it's long overdue. And had the AMA taken the active stance that it's taking now, years ago, a lot of physicians would not have been adversely targeted as they were over the past few years.
Well, I want to hear about how the presiding judge gets caught up in this, because I want to get clear if the judge is just the unwitting, is if the judge is being unwittingly duped by the narrative or somehow complicit in this distortion prevailing for so long. But before we do that, how about we get to know you? Tell us, introduce yourselves to us and what you want us to know about you as an individual.
So my name is Jay Joshi. I'm a general practicing physician in Northwest Indiana. I've always looked at medicine through an entrepreneurial lens, and had not what had happened to me, I probably would have remained firmly fixed in the world of healthcare, venture capital, and entrepreneurship. But life is what happens when you're busy planning other things. And throughout this course of my life, I ended up facing the criminal justice system, entering into the foray of the opiate epidemic. And I really learned how to apply those skills of an entrepreneur, knowledge brokering different concepts from different disciplines into a focused understanding of what needs to be done. And within the opiate epidemic, you start to see fundamental incongruencies in how the legal system operates within healthcare, incongruencies that you see with the abortion debate, incongruencies which you see in how the Affordable Care Act is being implemented at the state level. And so as I started to think along these lines, I began to realize that healthcare has a lot more fundamental problems than what people would realize. And that if I can tell my story, share what I have learned, but more importantly, help others share their stories and learn from their stories, I can then begin to understand how to help the legal system and medical world interact. And in the future, my goal is I hope to be advancing what I like to call medical jurisprudence, which is a fancy way of saying helping understand the intersection of healthcare and law and really become a thought leader in this space, because I think that it's sorely needed. And I think that my lived experiences of being adversely affected by the judicial system with my unique approach to healthcare positions me to understand what needs to be done and how to advance this principle more than most people. I think you might be on mute.
Thank you.
Not a problem.
Thank you so much. Um, I was thanking you for sharing that information with us, and then really wanting to get even more personal, if you don't mind,
Sure.
because one, I want the audience to understand the personal toll of this experience, and also the world needs to understand it, because the misuse of the legal system can be tantamount to a human rights violation. And America United International has is the culmination of this phenomena being addressed as a constitutional and human rights crisis. And it's been disregarded for so long that our country has failed to effectively um, address the topic, that it is even getting to the point that it's criminal, the allegations of crimes against humanity, because it's the whole contention that our rights are being deliberately violated, which can be a crime against humanity in and of itself, and then a disregard of these cases and this proliferation that can be a crime against humanity. So it's a big deal. But in getting to know the international human rights community and just the United States' place in it, and the extent to which the United States is susceptible to scrutiny around the world, because we are the architects of the gold standard for a fair and impartial administration of justice. And so AUI represents a constituency that people are saying that that's not what we're getting. So, the world is convinced, and rightly so, that our legal system is the gold standard for how you get a fair and impartial administration of justice. No one has ever taken the position that we're perfect and there's never any miscarriages of justice. That's impossible for any human institution. But decades ago, we started to suggest that it was these miscarriages of justice were happening too frequently at an intolerable level. And when I was venturing into about 2012 and getting to see the International Human Rights community, one of the things I was told is an obstacle that we have as Americans is the belief that even our worst problems are cushy compared to the atrocities that the rest of the world is experiencing when it comes to deliberate violations of rights at the hands of government officials. So we need to so that our viewing audience can relate to you and also to the world, so the world can relate to these problems that we're addressing and their real human toll. Tell us a bit about, what you were doing when this happened. How long had you been practicing medicine? Were you where were you insofar as your ambitions? Were you getting into a cushy lifestyle that you were comfortable and the world was, you had the world on the string? Tell us a bit about that and the impact of first realizing that you were a target of criminal prosecution, if you don't mind.
Sure. So this was 2018. I was 33 at the time. I had just opened my first clinic that I invested pretty much everything that I've earned to that point practicing. So I wasn't exactly enjoying a very big bank account because I was essentially, as an entrepreneur, trying to establish this company, establish this clinic. Um, we were about 15 months in. We had just received accreditation from the National Centers of Quality Assurances, which is one of the accrediting bodies to help develop relationships with Medicare beyond what most physicians enjoy. We were just designated as a patient-centered medical home when I was indicted.
Mm.
So it was a real odd situation in that in 1 week, you receive accreditation for running an award-winning practice and also get indicted for running an apparent pill mill, according to the Department of Justice. Well, I essentially was told by two defense attorneys that I have no choice but to plead guilty. And the rationale that they gave was that the opiate epidemic was too polarizing of an issue, the prosecutors are too aggressive, and that, and according to the words of my second defense attorney, nobody's going to think you're a victim.
Mm.
And so I believed them. I allowed myself to be characterized by how the prosecutors wanted to portray me, and I allowed myself to be influenced by a defense attorney who had no interest in providing any semblance of defense. So within 6 months, I just pleaded guilty. My defense attorney said, just plead guilty. If you don't fight back, they'll give you an easy sentence. Just don't say anything. Just let them do and say whatever they want, and they'll let you go away. Then you can resume your practice. Well, it didn't really work out that way. They sentenced me to prison. They gave me a 15-month sentence, of which I served 11 months because of good time and whatever metrics they use to measure how much time you actually have to serve. And I had to wait basically another year to get my medical license back. So now we're coming up on 4 years when everything first began to where I am now. In that time, I missed my son's second birthday. I've inflicted an untold amount of stress on my parents, on my in-laws, on my wife, and it's an incredibly difficult position to be in when you just see somebody on the street that you might know and who has now developed the impression of you based on the propaganda enacted by the prosecutors. So the prosecutors made claims that I was imitating another physician, that I had written 6,000 pain scripts, that I was giving prescription pills to an undercover agent's girlfriend. None of it was true,
Mm-hmm.
but it didn't stop them from saying these things. And it shows how prosecutors manipulate the media to influence the legal proceedings, because the judges don't know that the prosecutors are doing this. The judges have 40, 50 cases that they're just trying to speed through, and they're understaffed, and they're just trying to rush through it as quickly as possible. So in their haste, they simply default to trusting a prosecutor because most judges were former prosecutors. So essentially being told that I have no right to a defense because of the opioid epidemic and because I'm a physician indicted, I have to essentially let them do what they want to do to me. Told that if I just plead guilty and do no resistance, that I'll have a favorable outcome, not receiving a favorable outcome, and then essentially receiving this horrendous stigma that has basically perpetuated the entire world's impression of me, leads you to do down two paths. One, you can either fold and just let it break you, or you can use it to become stronger and start to identify ways that you can empower yourself. And I like to think that I'm in the latter. I feel that now I'm at a point where consistently I'm empowering myself and others by sharing their stories. But you just can't help but in those silent moments in the back of your head think, why did they do that to me? Like, why did that prosecutor say all those things and present all that false evidence for a conviction? Is that how much a conviction is worth to a prosecutor? That they would do all these things to me? And you start to understand now why AUI is so important because, yes, those convictions are currency to prosecutors, and they will do anything and everything to get those convictions. And while the American judicial system is the gold standard, the ideal of the judicial system is the gold standard. In actuality, and what happens in practice is far from it. What happens is you have judges who are understaffed, who are already facing 40 to 50 cases on any given day that they're just racing through. Prosecutors trying to get plea deals by any means necessary because that the prosecutor knows the judges prefer plea deals because plea deals are easier. So you have an entire system of bureaucracy that favors plea agreements and default sentencing because that's what makes the judge's life easier and that's what makes the prosecutor's life easier. It's through no fault or no overt sense of criminality by any one individual that the system dissolves into a bureaucratic processing machine. But by enabling that culture, you foster a culture of disingenuity from the prosecutors and the judges. That's essentially what you're starting to see. You're never going to have a judge, well, I'm going to say never because there are cases, even in recent history, of discriminatory policies by judges. But more likely than not, you're not going to have a judge make a biased ruling or engage in judicial misconduct through overt criminal intentions. Rather, it's the need for expediency, the unwillingness to delve into each individual case to understand the medical fundamentals underlying it that lead to the system of corruption that we have against physicians in the court of law.
Well, what I'd like to do is hear what you say and raise you one with regard to the problem, because these concerns that you have addressed so perfectly are societal problems.
Mhm.
And society is going to have problems, and so we should be about the business of solving them, because they're human institutions and nothing is perfect. The problem that our constituents have seen, because I started as a full-time U.S. legal system reform advocate, good government advocate, focused on appropriate judicial accountability in 1998. And the problem is that addressing those concerns and suggesting that the system needs to be tweaked at the very least. It needs to, there's some problems with it. It's going astray. The outcomes are contrary to public interest. Can get you targeted. Can get you labeled as a troublemaker. And at that point, that's really the weaponization that we're talking about. The very legal system, you become a critic of the legal system. And that can get you targeted, and then you find yourself the subject of various prosecutions. I've seen people's lives be terribly disrupted through code enforcement. Some people can have a town or a city come after them for some minor discrepancy. Your dog is not properly leashed, or your grass is too long. These are people who are known as being critics of the government or critics of the legal system. And that type of going after them at that expense can expose them to prosecution and fines and penalties and even jail time that they can ill afford. So what has happened, even the judge in this scenario, which you are painting as someone who understandably has too much to do and too little, wherewithal to contend with it, at some point they become aware that that is making them complicit in miscarriages of justice and creating these bad outcomes where good people who should be contributing to society are instead pleading guilty to crimes without even the benefit of a zealous defense in response to an overzealous prosecutor. So this is how it spins out of control, and this is really the reason for things getting to a point that there's America United International. Now, what I want to ask you is, how much of that did you realize already?
The idea that once judges and prosecutors are aware of their own misconduct, yet fail,
Or even just the problems that they're creating when we're supposed to have a legal system. It's the job of the judiciary for a fair and impartial administration of justice. And so when they become aware that their conduct may be, understandable to a certain extent, but contributing to a system that is certainly less than fair when you consider the toll that is taking on people who have gone and educated themselves and become physicians, and the importance of committed to good health care, providing good health care, and instead you're sitting in prison. That's what they're being made aware of, and the response is too often, they want to silence that. Even the U.S. Supreme Court has acknowledged that historically, people who are critical of people who administer the law, they tend to face retaliation for that. But I cut you off. Go ahead and finish what you were saying.
No, I think the whole component of retaliation is very real, and it's always laying in the back of your mind. You have to constantly weigh what you're doing against the risk of what you're doing. But, like you and I, we're very passionate about this issue. So we feel that it's justified, that we feel if we're not going to speak, who is going to speak? And I think one of the turning points in my life and why I feel AUI is such an important organization is the moment I realized that when judges and prosecutors are aware of the misconduct they committed, they're not really forthright in holding themselves accountable. In many ways, they would rather sweep it under the rug and move on. And it's this double standard that prosecutors and judges hold themselves to, where they feel that since they are the quote unquote guardians of justice, should they fail to administer justice or fail to live up to the constitutional ideals of administering justice, it's okay. But if somebody else were to do it, then we have to penalize them. And I think that's when you start to see a punitive legal system where you have those who are punished and you have the punishers. And I think that mindset comes when judges and prosecutors believe that they do not have to hold themselves accountable, even after they become aware of the misconduct that they've committed. So, like you, I think would understand that, hey, sometimes you need to give people the benefit of the doubt, and that's a reasonable position to take. But once it becomes unreasonable to think that a person, be it a prosecutor or a judge, is not aware of the misconduct that took place, yet it's allowed to permit, then you start to begin to wonder, what are the real intentions of the people who are administering justice, and why is this system allowed to perpetuate in the way that it is?
Exactly. So, in your experience working with doctors who have been caught up in this war on the opiate addiction, and they've become casualties, they've become targets, given that they're prescribing the opiate-based drugs. Is it usually the scenario of the less than zealous defense attorney, the overzealous prosecutor, and the overworked judge? Is that the typical scenario, or does it ever get different than that? that you know that often on a very often does it get different than that, or are those the usual dynamics?
You know, you can't detail each case
Mm-hmm.
in the same context. So without kind of getting into the individual nuances of different cases that I'm familiar with and some that I'm not as familiar with, I will say that there is a familiar pattern that all of these cases fall under, where there is inevitably some level of economic, financial, or criminal coercion in which a physician feels compelled to sign a plea agreement. And then subsequent to that plea agreement, there is propaganda campaign that mixes elements of truth with sensationalized false statements known to be false to then paint the picture in this horrendous light, followed by a sentence that usually results in prison time. You inevitably see this pattern play out over and over. And I think part of it has to do with how the Controlled Substance Act, which is the law that the prosecutors use to continue this cycle of speculative indictments and speculative convictions without any true factual basis, using data as criminal intent. That law allows prosecutors to create varying interpretations of behavior that they can then define as criminal. And I don't want to get too technical here,
Mm-hmm.
but what a lot of prosecutors do is they focus on this concept of negative rights, where they say, you should have done this. You should have known better. Had you had done this, then X, Y, and Z would not have happened. And it becomes very speculative. And if that logic was applied in any other criminal case, be it getting into a fatal car accident or causing injury to another person accidentally or inadvertently, you would never use the context or the logic, you should have known better. If you had done this, that would have happened. This whole concept of saying in the negative that because X, Y, and Z did not happen, you are therefore criminally liable, puts physicians in an extremely disadvantageous position because they're essentially defending against speculation and potentiality. They're not actually arguing against the facts. So when a physician presents clinical evidence, factual statements from patients, it's not seen in the same light as this negative speculative information is presented as. And so inadvertently, you see physicians being compelled to sign plea agreements and then a sentence under the general basis of general deterrence,
Mm-hmm.
which is a principle from utilitarianism that's actually supposed to balance lower punishments with community goodwill. But for whatever reason, general deterrence has basically been justified by judges to just slap somebody with an enormous sentence that then scares everybody in the community and that they don't want to be the next person. But that's really not the interpretation of general deterrence. Yet, as you know, interpretation goes out the window when you're at the position prosecutors and judges are reinterpreting the law to enact policies that try to moralize the legal system stance on the opiate epidemic.
Mm-hmm. So what's the toll on the patients of
Well,
all this happening?
the quality of care is defined by the fear of prosecution. So now physicians are less focused on providing good patient care and more focused on avoiding the legal ire of local and federal law enforcement. So if you're a patient in pain, or if you're a patient with a substance use dependency, that prescription, that medication that may have been allowing you to live your life, perform your daily duties, be gainfully employed, is no longer as easily available. Or you have to run through these expensive tests that may not be covered by your insurance company, like urine drug screens once a month, imaging studies for the sake of imaging studies, just so you can demonstrate, hey, I got an imaging study. So if a DEA comes after me, I can say, hey, I got an x-ray for this prescription pill. Effectively, what you're doing is you're exchanging poor quality of care for legal risk mitigation. You're no longer ordering imaging studies or urine drug screens because they're clinically necessary. You're ordering them because they will be perceived as good legal practice should you ever be criminally indicted. So
Mm-hmm.
what happens to the individual patient is that their care is no longer the focus of the physician. It's instead the legal policies that guide physician fear.
Exactly. Now, has the impact on the patients been quantified in terms of morbidity or sub, suffering? Has it been quantified at all?
Well, short answer, yes. But I just want to caution before I throw some numbers out there that medicine is not a number.
Hmm.
You can't contextualize the complexity of patient care through a simple rubric of a data point. But we as society have been acclimated to looking at healthcare in that way. So in 2020, when we see that 93,000 patients overdosed, those who want to blame physicians will say they overdosed due to opioids in general, not parsing through the details of whether that was illicit fentanyl obtained on the streets or prescription opioids. Those who want to correct the erroneous narratives on the opiate epidemic will point out that the overdose metrics are directly related to the presence of illicit fentanyl and the lack of good care provided by physicians due to the fear of the law. So a number is just a number that can be contextualized by whoever wants to present the number as they want. And so what happens in healthcare, because it's distilled down into the simple standards that lawyers in the law likes to look at, we also start to reduce the overall impact, the burden of pain into these metrics. And that is an enormous disservice to patients because now if a patient is able to maintain their opioid prescription for necessary chronic pain, they may have a lower dose. They may not be able to work as much. They may not be able to provide for their family economically. How do you quantify that partial burden relative to a total burden, which may be mortality or maybe overdose rates in the ER? It's very difficult to fully encapsulate the true impact the DEA and Department of Justice on patients with chronic pain, with anxiety, with substance use dependency, because nobody has really understood the degrees of burden that are imposed upon patients that can be quantified and that are more qualitative nature. We simply distill down to the most obvious metrics and then recontextualize it to portray whatever narrative makes sense for the person speaking.
And so, and what's the impact on the medical professionals? Is it impacting their specialization choices, their decisions to become doctors altogether?
I think I don't know if it's affecting your decision to specialize. I will say that despite the advances we've made in healthcare, primary care is still looked down upon relative to other specialties. I don't know if that's an opioid related policy, but what I will say is that physicians are now passing off the burden of prescribing as much as possible. So you'll see a lot of primary care physicians just send patients to pain specialists. You'll see a lot of surgeons just send patients to the primary care specialist so they don't have to prescribe opioids. What you see is a lot of hand wringing and passing the baton for people who don't want to take the legal risk of prescribing a medication to a patient, knowing full well that that can then come back and create a legal consequence for that physician. So what you're seeing is a field of medicine run by physicians who are not making decisions in the best interest of their patients, but are simply making clinical decisions that would reduce the amount of legal risk they'll have to face. And that's bad for medicine, that's bad for physicians, and that's horrible for patient care.
And to be clear, with regard to an economic impact on the physicians, because this is important that everybody know the real deal in that regard. And Doctors of Courage is an organization that advocates for embattled physicians. So we're going to be getting a lot of personal insights. But tell us, so you get targeted and you get prosecuted and you end up having to take a deal. So so what happens to the physician? Is it okay, now you no longer have 3 Mercedes and a summer home and a winter home, and now some of your children go to public school, and you have to, your vacations are only 1 week instead of 2 weeks a year. Tell us about that reality.
Well, for me specifically, I had just invested in opening a clinic, so I didn't really have a bank account to speak of because everything was invested in starting this clinic off the ground. My wife, she works, so my family was able to support ourselves. I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm in any position to boast about economically or financially, but what I will say is that judging the hardship a person endures relative on the perception of their financial stability or socioeconomic status is the main reason why America is so divided. We can't simply look at somebody and say, I feel like you should be better off than me. And so if you're not, you got what you deserved.
Mhm.
That essentially leads to discriminatory policies. It leads us to look at concepts like multiculturalism and race as a zero sum game where your gain is at my loss, or create issues where people in Wall Street are unethical and that people who are the honest, hardworking farmers are ethical. It's easy and nice to come up with these narratives, but I think that if you really want true justice, you should want due process for everybody. And
Mhm.
instead of looking at them through the caricature of stereotypes, look at them through the legal details of the case that they've gone through and the misconduct inflicted upon them. Because I promise you that if you identify it for one class of individuals, one class of defendants, it'll resonate with other class of defendants. It'll trickle down. And judicial reform for one group of defendants will help another group of defendants. And that by working together and shining a light of transparency, everybody benefits.
Excellent points. We got a couple of questions from our audience. So here's one. Why are people dying from drug overdose while the number of prescriptions for controlled substances have actually dropped?
Yeah, I think that's a prime example of substitution patterns presented as solutions. The DEA and the Department of Justice many years ago erroneously correlated opioid prescriptions with opioid mortality, as I alluded to, simplifying the complexity of pain management, of addiction medicine, down to this speculative correlation of prescription quantities, opioid mortalities. And by doing so, they violated what is called the law of unintended consequences, where they now diverted an entire population of patients and those who would have benefited with medical oversight to now take street heroin, street fentanyl. And this is a problem that's only going to get worse post Afghanistan, because now you're going to see even more quantities of fentanyl, even more quantities of heroin flooding the streets at ever cheaper prices. And as patients feel disenfranchised by the healthcare system, they're going to turn to means of self medicating. And that usually means illicit substances like heroin and fentanyl. And this is the direct consequence of the DEA's policy to criminalize opiate prescribing and instill this culture of medical McCarthyism, where effectively the accusation is the basis for the conviction. And by targeting physicians in this manner, they artificially reduce the amount of control prescriptions, which have then disproportionately disenfranchised those patients with medical needs like chronic pain, substance use dependency, mental conditions like ADHD and anxiety, to the point where now they're looking for illicit opportunities to obtain those medications. And by doing so, overdoses increase because patients cannot self-medicate if they don't even know what they're taking.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour, and we have we have actually two very compelling questions that we're going to um, record and take up probably at a subsequent interview. They were talking about the role of health insurance companies in coming after physicians, and then the second question is related to the role of health insurance companies, healthcare fraud prevention partnerships causing some of these problems. So we're not going to delve into that today because we're going to be talking, in fact, our next interview for AUI is going to be of Dr. Linda Cheeks, the founder or co-founder, I believe, of Doctors of Courage. So this is a topic that we're going to be talking about pretty regularly. So at the end of the hour, we're coming up on the end of the hour, we can go over a couple of minutes because we had a delay because of the Facebook technicalities. But Dr. Joshi, I just really want to thank you for being our guest and doing such a great job in creating public awareness about not, you know, America United International, as well as your work and your personal experiences in dealing with this very troubling problem with regard to the use and seemingly abuse of our legal system and embattled particularly primary care physicians. Um, how can we find out more about your work?
Well, I think you alluded to it. There's organizations like Doctors of Courage, which have been led by people like Dr. Linda Cheeks, who provide an excellent opportunity for physician advocacy and patient advocacy as well for those disenfranchised by the opiate epidemic. You can see my writings all over the internet on various different platforms. But I think the best way is to really reach out to me directly. My personal email is jjoshi45@gmail.com. It's spelling jjoshi45@gmail.com. Send me an email with any questions, anything that I can be of service to you or your organization. I think what we really need to realize is that there's more that unites us than separates us in the opiate epidemic and with judicial misconduct in general. And if we can find ways to support each other's stories, advocate and create transparency on the misconduct that took place, we collectively build a certain level of credibility that was necessary in order to affect change at the legislative level. And I think that having that mindset is the first step to really making meaningful change.
And we're really going to be with AUI and also advocates who deal with other forms of wrongful convictions, focusing in on the role, the extent to which presiding judges are complicit. Because again, in the criminal justice system, there's a lot of focus in on the arresting officers, the investigation, the prosecutor. And so often the presiding judges are somewhat seem to be unwitting victims themselves of the bad intentions and the overzealousness of these other legal system players. However, in this day and time, it's time to relook at that and see that, you know, we not only are dealing with stories where there seems to be an obstinate disregard of the defendant's rights, and it seemed like a determination to help the prosecution win and impose the most severe sanctioning possible. But at the very least, just disregarding their you know, their contribution to these bad outcomes. And that's what we're going to focus in on a lot with America United International. So I want everyone to please go to www.americaunitedinternational.net. Everything is spelled just as you see, you know, their regular spelling, all lowercase. AmericaUnitedInternational.net, www.americaunitedinternational.net, and learn about our organization, join our efforts, and donate so we can sustain this work. Because as Dr. Joshi said, this is a grassroots effort. Even small contributions go far when many people contribute. AUI, America United International, is you, YOU. It's our solution, and it's our job to sustain the campaign. None of us cause organized organized abuse of the U.S. legal system, but working together, we certainly can solve that problem. In the meantime, be safe and keep the faith. We'll see you again next time.